Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor and I'm a Sony Imaging Ambassador, and I'd like to talk to you about your choice of lens when working with full frame cameras. Now this is a subjective review really, because I do have my own personal preferences, but I possibly will give you some ideas that you may not have thought of when you're actually choosing the lenses you're going to work with. Now it's predominantly for full frame cameras, but I will also be introducing the notion of working with APS-C mode and also APS-C lenses. So if you're currently using an APS-C camera, it's probably worth watching as well. Now first off, I'm going to introduce these three G master lenses. They're the 16-35, the 24-70 and the 70-200. Now some professionals think that these are the indispensable three lenses that any pro photographer should own, and they've basically acquired the name the Holy Trinity of zoom lenses. Now I'm going to give you some prices during this video, and they're the prices that I've checked on B&H from New York in 2021. So we're looking at over $6,500 US and over 3 kilograms or 6.7 pounds of heavy metal and glass here. Now I'm going to give you some alternatives as well. For instance, there are some photographers who prefer to work with prime lenses. Now these are 6 F1.8 prime lenses that Sony make. Now it does include 2 G master lenses, 1 G lens and 1 Zeiss design lenses. Now they will operate as sharp or even sharper at the wider apertures than those Holy Trinity of G master zoom lenses. Now for a photographer who is going to buy these 6 prime lenses instead of the zooms, you are going to have a weight saving and also a cost saving as well. You're going to have an extra $1,500 or more left in your back pocket when choosing these primes. Now of course many photographers will say, but I really don't want to be changing lenses every time. I want to change my focal length. That is of course the advantage of working with zooms. But I'm going to give you some ideas why working with primes is not the problem or issue that many photographers think it might be. So let's move forward here. Now on these 6 f1.8 primes I've introduced, we do actually have a wider angle of view on that 14mm f1.8 lens than the 16-35, but we don't have quite the reach on the telephoto side. That is a 135 G master prime, so we don't have that 200mm reach. Now I'm going to show or move on to show you why this may not be a problem if you do want that full range. Now of course if you wanted to match that angle of view, or even better that angle of view with a zoom lens, you're going to have to look at the 12-24 G master, the F2.8 version. Now this is of course this is going to raise your outlay price. You're now going to be investing more than $7,500 and you're going to be up to 7 pounds of metal, over 3 kilograms. And some would say that for an astrophotographer in particular, that 14mm f1.8 lens is still going to give you a certain advantage over that 12-24. Yes, you don't have that 12mm angle of view, but what you do have is an aperture that is 1 1/3 stops brighter. So instead of capturing this astro scene at ISO 3200, I'm capturing it at 1250. Now that is going to make a significant difference with the amount of noise that you're dealing with when you're working this astro image in post-production. Now I don't use those 6 primes. I don't take all 6 of those primes out on location, even though I actually own them, and I don't use those 3 G master zooms. I have owned them in the past, but I've chosen to work predominantly with primes, and that is a personal choice. It is not the choice that is suited for everyone. But what I have done is I've switched out the 35mm f1.8 for the 35mm f1.4 G master lens, and I'm going to introduce why I've made that decision in some slides that I will look at shortly. I've still got that weight saving. In fact, I've got much more of a weight saving, and I've also got $2,700 change from having worked with those three G Master zooms. Now, if you notice that I've chosen to predominantly go out with 4 primes, not all 6 primes, you may notice that there was a bit of a jump from the 35mm angle of view to the 85mm angle of view. Now, I do own the 55mm 1.8 Zeiss design lens, and it is very sharp, wide open, but often I don't feel the need to always go out with that 55mm. I can make do with a 35, 85 and maybe 1 or 2 other primes. And the reason for that is when I'm working events such as parades or demonstrations or sporting events where I'm up and in amongst the people that I'm photographing, there is literally just 3 steps between 135 for a head and shoulders portrait and 35mm head and shoulders portrait. That is simply 3 steps, and they're not giant steps either. They're just 3 average steps between getting that head and shoulders portrait with a 35 and maybe taking 3 steps back and getting the head and shoulders portrait with the 135. Now, I will go on to say that there is a difference when we actually change our position to the subject. Basically, with that wider angle of view, the distant subject behind our primary target will look further away. And I'll show a slide that showcases that in slightly clearer than I've explained it here. Okay, so we're literally just 1.5 steps between the 85mm and the 35mm head and shoulders portrait, and that is why I often leave that 55 at home, because 1.5 steps is nothing when we're dealing with a situation where we need to get that head and shoulders portrait, and that obviously does reduce the number of times I'm changing my prime lens. I'm basically zooming with my feet. Just 1.5 steps forward, 1.5 steps back. Now, for photographers who are looking to save even more weight with the 4 primes that I'm using, you could look at the idea of switching out that 135 G Master, the 1.8, for a 135 2.8. This is a Zeiss Batis lens. It is very sharp, it is fast focusing, but we are losing that 1 1/3 stops advantage on the aperture. Now, it's a fast focusing lens, as I've said. It does use the linear focus motors, so you can use that just like the 135 G Master from Sony. You can use them in sporting contexts because it will keep up with people running, dogs running, anything to do with sports basically. And we do still have a good deal of figure ground separation. You will still blur the backgrounds when we're working up close and personal to our subjects. The difference between 1.8 and 2.8 is not huge when it comes to that figure ground separation. So that is a weight saving and cost saving that some of you might want to think about. Now, if you've made that choice with those 4 primes, including the Zeiss Batis, you're going to have over $3,000 change from having chosen the 3 G Master zooms. Now, what are you going to do with that money? And my suggestion would be purchase a second body. Any professional going to a professional shoot is not going to go with one body. Any camera can fail on any given day. Now that's not going to happen every year or even every other year, but basically anything with moving parts does have the capability of failing at some time, just like any Mercedes car can break down. It is just basically obvious that something that has moving parts can fail. So going to shoot with a second body is of course what most professionals will choose to do. Now, again, if you're choosing to work with prime lenses instead of zoom lenses, this does give you the option of working with two bodies with two different primes, and that again is going to reduce the number of times you actually need to change the lens. Now, what you're looking at here is a slide of a small messenger bag. This is and it's carrying an Alpha 9 II with the Zeiss Batis 135 and the Alpha 7C, the compact full frame body, working with the 35 F1.8 G master lens. Now, I can actually cover events just with the two bodies and two lenses. I don't need any other equipment, and so people who think that maybe they'll be disadvantaged by zooms, I don't find that disadvantage with the way that I personally work. Now, if you are wanting to stick with zooms but you can't afford the outlay of the G Masters and you do want less weight, there are F4 versions of those three zooms. We've got the 1635 F4, the Zeiss design lens. We've got the 24-105 f4, which is a very good sharp zoom, and it is something that when I was looking at saving weight, I switched out the 24-70 G Master for the 24-105, knowing that I would always have a wide aperture prime with me. At the end of the day, I didn't go out with the f4 lens as much as I thought, so I actually retired that lens from service. And then we have the 70-200 f4. Now, this is a much smaller zoom lens than the 70-200 2.8, and it does have a linear focus motor, so it is again fast focusing. I would have to suggest that the 24-70 and the 70-200 G Master lenses, they don't use the very fast linear focus motors that we're used to seeing Sony put out on all of their primes and all of their modern zooms now. So they're not the fastest focusing zooms. So if you were looking at using the 24-70 and the 70-200 G Master in a sporting context, you just have to be aware that they're not the fastest focusing Sony lenses, and that is something that should be considered. So if we were to go for these f4s, they would still be heavier than the four primes that I go out, and you would have trouble fitting all three of them and a camera body in a small messenger bag. You're basically wanting to then use a backpack if you want to take out all three zooms, or a very much larger messenger bag, which I find difficulty with by putting too much weight on one shoulder. Now, if you were to go for those f4 zoom options as well, you're going to lose the opportunity for shooting images with large amounts of background blur or bokeh. We're not going to get that f1.8 look of that really shallow depth of field, and this is the primary reason that I use the primes rather than the zooms. I do like that figure ground separation. In this particular portrait, the young woman is sitting in front of a wall that is full of graffiti. She's actually quite close to the wall, but the background blur is so significant on the 135 at maximum aperture that we get this beautiful shallow depth of field and no distractions in the background. This is again with the f1.8 aperture, and you can see even now she's right in front of that background, but we basically reduce the background just to this silken smooth bokeh. Even in wildlife shots which I've captured with the 135 prime, which has a close focusing distance, we can get that huge figure ground separation, which can really only be achieved with the 1.8. If we were using a 100-400 for instance, we would be down to a maximum aperture of f5.6, and that's more than 3 stops difference. Even with the wide angle lenses, which tend to have much more depth of field, native depth of field at wider apertures, you're still going to be able to get figure ground separation by getting very close to your foreground subject matter and using that maximum f1.8 aperture. If we were using the 1635 f4 at f4, we would struggle to defocus that background unless we were exceptionally close to the foreground. If the idea of primes really interests you, and maybe you're coming up from APS-C, but some of the larger primes, such as that 135 and maybe the 14mm 1.8, if those are not attractive because of their physical size and weight, there are very light full frame primes available. Sony have just added 3 light full frame primes with that 35 2.8 Zeiss design, which comes in at just 120 grams. It's still Sony's smallest full frame lens, even with the addition of the 3 new G lenses. That's the 24, the 40 and the 50mm. The 40mm is not pictured in this slide. Now, if you wanted to find an ultra wide angle prime that was much smaller than the 20mm f1.8, it's not a huge lens, that 20mm f1.8, but we can reduce the physical size and weight even more by going to an f2.8 option. And for people who often stop down to f8 or f11 to shoot landscapes, obviously the 2.8 maximum aperture on that Tamron over there on the left is not going to put you off. So while Sony don't have that 2.8, there are non-Sony options that you can look at to reduce weight. Unfortunately, anybody who's looking to reduce the size and weight of the 85, which is again not a huge lens, and I do use that on APS-C cameras to get a 135 equivalent angle of view, and that is a beautiful lens on those APS-C cameras, but at the moment no one seems to be making an 85mm 2.8 autofocus lens, so that is going to be the largest of these small primes if you're really trying to shave off the weight. And again, you are going to save more money by buying these very small primes. We're not going to better the apertures in most cases to the G Master zooms, but we are significantly under on the weight and also saving more than $3,500 in the cost. Some people who are on a budget but want those f2.8 apertures on those zooms may start looking at the Tamron lenses. Tamron have created 3 2.8 zooms that are really quite light. They almost look like they're f4 zooms rather than 2.8 zooms. No, we don't have the range of 1635, we only have 1728, and that's one of the reasons for the weight saving there. We have 2875, so we're not a 2470 on that lens in the middle, and we don't go out to the full 200mm reach on their 70 to 180. There's also a bit of a weight saving on that 70-180 in the fact that it doesn't have optical steady shot or vibration reduction in that lens, and that is a little bit of a concern. Yes, we can use the in-body image stabilization on the wider zooms, but when you're looking at the telephoto zoom, it is good to have that optical steady shot. Now, the Sony lenses do have that optical steady shot on their telephoto zooms, and that is because we really need the lens optical steady shot as well as the camera steady shot when we're pushing out the focal length of the lens. If you're interested in those really light primes I was showcasing just previously, basically the 24 f2.8 and the 40 and 50 2.5 apertures. The 2.5 seems like quite a strange maximum aperture, but it's one stop less than the 1.8 that we typically find on those wide aperture primes. And this Weight Watchers Light and Easy video will look in more detail to those light primes. Now let's come back to my choice to switch out the 35 1.8 for the 35 1.4 G Master. Now this one is a really important decision for me because I really want to maintain that figure ground separation when working with a wide angle lens. Now, we often find that with the wide angle lenses we are going to get more depth of field, so we need a wider aperture, as wide as possible in fact, to get that figure ground and separation that we might be used to seeing with an 85mm 1.8 or the 50mm 1.2, which I haven't mentioned in this video. So we have the ability with a half-length portrait to defocus the background at maximum aperture on this 35mm, which is important for me because I've sort of modified my street style of photography for shallow depth of field. I used to stop down to f11 or f16 using the Sony 16 rule, but now I'm more often working at maximum aperture on that 35mm focal length. And if we are going to get very close to our subject, we can create very shallow depth of field. In this portrait, we can see that the wall behind this woman is completely defocused. At maximum aperture, with the head slightly at an angle, we won't even get both eyes sharp. So yes, we can get that really shallow depth of field with the 35mm f1.4. Now if I want that 50mm angle of view, all I have to remember to do is not take that extra step forward and shoot with the 35mm and then crop in post. That gives me the 50mm equivalent angle of view by zooming in post-production rather than moving closer when I'm actually at the scene. Now if I take out a vertical portrait shot from a horizontal image or a landscape format image, now we do get that 50mm angle of view again. Now if I'm taking these crops out of a 24 megapixel sensor such as the Alpha-7C, I'm still down to more than 10 megapixels. Now there's 8.3 megapixels in a 4K export, so on a very sharp lens I'm not sacrificing any quality by making these type of crops on a 24 megapixel sensor. Now when we're cropping in post-production or even cropping in camera, when we're choosing one of the R cameras, the A7R2, A7R3, A7R4 or even the Alpha 1, we are megapixel rich. Now there is an opportunity to, rather than crop in post-production, we can crop in camera. Now some people will always prefer to crop in post-production, but there is really no difference in the final look whether we choose to crop in camera or crop in post. We are going to get closer to our subject in the viewfinder. If we're cropping in camera, we're basically going to zoom in to our subject, and so this is something that I'm not really afraid to do on the R cameras or the Alpha 1. Now when we do choose to shoot in APS-C mode on the Alpha 1, we reduce the megapixel count from 50 megapixels to 21 megapixels. Some people will say, oh well, surely that will lower quality. Well, not necessarily if you're not creating a very, very large print. If we're just going out to a 4K image for social media or even a double page spread in a magazine, so long as we're using a G or G Master glass or even the 85 1.8 is spectacularly sharp wide open, we're not going to sacrifice any quality by cropping in camera or in post-production. Now that 21 megapixels that we've reduced to is actually a higher resolution than the Canon 1DX Mark III shooting in full frame mode. So there are full frame cameras around that shoot with less resolution than when we're working with, say, the A7R4 or the A1 cameras in APS-C mode. Now if you're cropping in camera with a 24 megapixel camera such as the A7 III or the Alpha 7C, it is a little bit tight. Now what I've done here is I'm showing an image that has been cropped in camera and we're looking at the pixel width to 3936 pixels. Now the width of a 4K image in horizontal format or landscape format is 3840, so it is a little bit close. If we crop the aspect ratio to 16:9 in post-production, we're left with 8.7 megapixels and we need 8 8.3 for one of those 4K images. If we crop any tighter and then export a 4K image, there will be interpolation. Basically, the software will start adding imaginary pixels from the best guess of the surrounding pixels, and that does lead to a little bit of softening of sharp focus. So it's not something, or it's something that I personally try to avoid doing, is shooting in APS-C mode on a 24 megapixel sensor. Let's take a look at APS-C mode, which is a 1.5 crop factor. Now this would be the same if we're using an APS-C lens on a full frame camera or using APS-C mode. So there we have the 24 megapixel cameras on the top row there, and there's the megapixel count, 10 megapixels, which will reduce a little bit more if we start using the 16:9 aspect ratio. We've got a healthy 18 megapixels on the A7R2 and A7R3, on the Alpha 1 21 megapixels, and the Alpha 7R4 is 26 megapixels, or really high resolution, even more than the 24 megapixel cameras. So yes, we have lots of resolution, and that resolution is a great advantage for somebody who chooses to shoot with prime lenses, and this is something that I will cover now. Now we've got more with a 50 megapixel or 60 megapixel sensor, or even the 42 megapixel sensors, we can actually get a 2 times crop out of our lenses in post-production, or 1.5 in camera and then crop a little bit more in post-production. So a 35mm F1.4 G master, if we exercise that 2 times crop, it starts behaving like a 70mm 2.8. We have to apply the 2 times crop factor to the aperture in terms of depth of field, the equivalent depth of field, not exposure, but just depth of field. So it behaves like a 2470 G master at 70mm with the maximum aperture. So we can zoom in post-production or zoom with our feet on that 35mm and almost get the full range of that 2470 G master zoom. So what I'm highlighting here is an image on the left captured with the 85mm f1.8 at f2.8, and there on the right, instead of walking closer now, I've cropped closer. I've done a 4K crop, which is a 2.25 crop factor. Its equivalent focal length now is approximately 77 millimeters, so getting very close to that 85mm. Now on the inset image you can see how far I am away from the subject. And then I actually stopped down to 2.8 on the 85mm just to get sort of an approximate or equivalent depth of field. Now because I'm cropping in and I'm not walking in closer with that 35mm, the background looks or appears to be the same distance away from the subject. If I step closer to get that head and shoulders portrait, I will have a higher resolution and the background will seem to recede more into the distance. And this slide explains that quite well. Here we have the 85mm head and shoulders portrait on the left, and instead of cropping closer now, I've done that 1.5 steps to get closer with the 35mm, and you can see the city skyline in the background now basically get much smaller. It recedes into the distance. So I have choices with that 35mm. I can crop in post, or I can get closer. It's all about creating the figure ground relationship that you're looking for in that composition. Now cropping on the Alpha 1 is obviously really one of its strong points. What you can see here is an image that I captured with the FE200-600. Now this will be working at a maximum aperture of f6.3, and I would have done that because of the high shutter speed. And we can see the crop taken from that 50 megapixel file. Now there's 2160 pixels high on a 4K screen. Doesn't matter how big that screen is. It could be a 30-inch desktop monitor or a 70-inch TV in your lounge room. Basically, the height in pixels is 2160 pixels. That is a constant, and you can see from that very aggressive crop there, I didn't even need to well, I could have cropped even further, but chose to end the crop there because I wanted the shadow underneath the dog in full flight. So if we take a look at 3 of those vertical crops from those horizontal images, we can see that we're still detail rich. It's important when we're working with these high resolution cameras to use the best quality glass we can if we're going to start cropping really aggressively, because it's no point in having a really high resolution sensor with cheap glass. And this is one of the things where I would possibly avoid using non-Sony lenses. We might be happy with their resolution in a full frame, but when we start zooming in, can we still see the fine detail in the hair of these greyhound dogs if we're cropping so aggressively? We need the resolving power of the lenses to match the high resolution sensors. Here's a good example of one of Sony's, it's probably the lens that is most optically perfect of any of their prime lenses, and this is the 135 F1.8 G master lens. Now I'm applying a 2.25 times crop to extract the 4K image from the 50 megapixel file. So this 135 lens starts behaving with that crop as if it was a 300mm f4 lens. Sony don't actually make this focal length, but this is what it would look like if they did and you did not crop. And as we can see, with that 300mm telephoto focal length and f4, we still get huge amounts of figure ground separation. And because it is one of their best G master primes, we do have very rich detail, even cropping so aggressively. Here it is, the same equation played out in bird photography. We've got the larger than 8K master uncropped image. I'm going in with that 4K crop. So again, that 135 is behaving like a 300mm f4. That 135 is a very fast focusing lens. So with this explosion of activity with this eagle about to catch some bait, it's really caught everything absolutely pinch up and kept up with the focus. Now just some clarification about the crop factor. Yes, we're applying it to get the equivalent angle of view. So when we apply a 1.5 crop factor to a 100mm focal length, you've got a 150mm full frame equivalent. We also apply it to the aperture to obtain the equivalent depth of field. So that is an important part of the equation, but the exposure doesn't change. We're still shooting with an f1.8 wide open, so we're still going to have that very low ISO when capturing with these wide aperture primes, even though the depth of field might be greater than the 1.8. So that ability to use that 1.84 exposure is, however, important in terms of noise, because really we need to apply the crop factor to the noise as well, because as we crop in post, we're effectively zooming in on the size of that noise, so we're magnifying the noise when we're cropping in. So images will look like they're being captured at a high ISO if we're cropping very aggressively in post-production. And that perhaps is one of the great resounding successes of the Alpha 1, is it does have good or excellent high ISO performance. So when I'm cropping in on those running greyhounds, we're not staring down the barrel of unacceptable noise. Let's take a look at how I can work an event with just 2 lenses on 2 bodies. So it's the 2 from 4 section of this video tutorial. I'll start with the 20mm f1.8 G and the 85 1.8. No G, but it performs and is as sharp as one of Sony's G primes. So Let's go to a recent shoot that I did in the rainforest in tropical far north Queensland here. Now, quite easily on the image on either side of the three central ones, you can see that I'm using a wide angle lens. It's getting pretty much everything in front of me in my field of vision into the image. So this is great for dramatic shots of the forest floor, etc. The three images in the center column there are all captured with the 85mm at maximum aperture. So I would stop down the 20mm f1.8 quite often to get the extra depth of field, but I usually use the 85mm 1.8 wide open, and that is to isolate. I need to isolate something inside of that forest for the viewer to look at, whether it's just a few leaves growing on a tree or a flower, or the central image is an image of a golden orb spider. Now that is heavily cropped in post-production using 2 or 2.25 crop factor on that central image. So it's an 85mm, but it's got a little bit of reach. We're looking as if it's an equivalent of 160 or 170mm reach on that central image. And the 85mm doesn't have a very great close focusing distance, but if I'm standing back and then zooming in post-production, it's close enough. And so I've managed to get that spider filling the frame on that central image, and that would go 4K on a 4K monitor. Let's take a look at the other two in those four images and how I can work an event with just choosing these two. This is the 35mm f1.4 GM and the 135 f1.8. Now sometimes I would use the Zeiss Batis. I love the 135 focal length so much, I own two. So let's take a look at an event here in Melbourne. I've listed them as the 135 just so you can clearly see which are the ones captured with that lens. Now when I'm working with the 135, I tend to be on the edge of a crowd and a few steps back in order to get that head and shoulders portrait, and we do get a nice smooth background behind our shots. Occasionally, if you can see the image in the bottom right hand corner, I'll occasionally purposely stand or position the camera in front of somebody that I'm shooting over or past to create foreground blur as well as background blur to build up a sense of depth within the image. As soon as I move into the crowd, now I don't need to change lens because I'm using two bodies, remember, I will just switch cameras out in the messenger bag and now start shooting inside or in amongst the people in the crowd with the 35mm f1.4 at f1.4. And so this is a useful focal length where I can't step back because there are people directly behind me. So the two lenses seem to serve me well when working an event. I'm either at the edge of the crowd or I'm in amongst the crowd taking pictures of these characters. Same thing, this is a demonstration in Melbourne this time, and now we're looking at you can probably work out which are the two 135s after I've done that little exercise with you on the previous one. And of course top right is the 35mm, again with some foreground blur, and the bottom left we get a nice wide shot which puts the policeman in context with the Parliament House there. Giving you the idea or building the narrative of that this is a demonstration in progress. And again, just revisiting this slide that I showed you earlier, in order to split the difference between the 35 and the 135, I do have the opportunity just to stand a little bit further back, crop in post and get that 50mm or 85mm angle of view in post-production. And because I don't have that 200mm reach, I do have the opportunity of cropping in post on the 135 to give me the equivalent 200 or more, 200 to 300mm reach if we're using the Alpha 1 or the Alpha 7R4 camera. Let's take a look at the widest of these lenses that I choose to go out with. It's the 20mm F1.8 G. Now it's the widest F1.8 G that will accept screw-on filters. The 14mm with that sort of hemispherical front element will need a filter cage, and it's possibly one of the reasons I gravitate to using that 20mm. All four of these lenses on this slide all share the 67mm filter thread. I should correct myself there. The Zeiss Batis has the 67mm thread, so I can go out with four lenses all sharing the same filter if I need to. And I use those magnetic filters that you may have seen me review, so I can simply pull off the filter off one lens and plop it onto another very quickly if I need to. Now, for many of you who are wanting the wider angle of view, some might be put off by that 20mm. It isn't as wide as the 16mm on the zoom, and it's certainly not as wide as the 14 or 12 on those lenses that Sony also offer. But I have a way around that, and that is to create a panoramic image. Now, when I am wanting that extreme wide angle of view, 95% of the time it is for a landscape with a big angle of view that I'm trying to put into a single image. Now I will work a panorama in just 3 vertical images, and I work with a 50% overlap, so whatever is in the middle of one image ends up on the edge of the side image that I'm moving to either side. Now when I merge these in post-production, I can get an angle of view of 14mm or wider by merging these 3 images. Now when you've got a lot of foreground information very close to the lens, which is often common in when we're constructing landscape images with something of interest in the immediate foreground, if we're trying to make it easier for the software to merge or stitch these 3 images without making any errors, we really have to rotate the camera around the no parallax point. If we mount the camera on a tripod, just in the tripod fixing on the camera, we can get parallax error where the foreground information will align but then not the background, or vice versa. In order to get the foreground and background information aligning very easily, we really need to offset the camera on what's called a nodal rail. These can be picked up really quite cheaply on places like eBay or B&H, etc. So what you're looking at there is my Alpha 7C. It's moved further back, and because I need to shoot in vertical orientation, I'm also acquiring an L bracket from Small Rig, and these two products weigh just 260 grams. They don't even weigh as much as one of the primes that I'm going out shooting with. It's almost the weight of one of those micro primes, if you like. So there's a look of those 3 images again. 14mm angle of view. Technically you could get even wider than this, but when I merge these images, I often don't get that really steep perspective. I get the angle of view but without the steep perspective of that, say, 12mm. So I think the angle of view looks more like a 14mm. So this is definitely worth checking out. You can find the no parallax point of your lens by lining up something in the foreground, a vertical line in the foreground, and then a vertical line in the background, maybe 2 telegraph poles or 2 trees. The idea is, you know, you've got your no parallax point when you start turning the camera and the tree or telegraph pole in the distance doesn't move in relation to the telegraph pole or tree in the foreground. So you can hide one telegraph pole behind the forward, the foremost telegraph pole, and as you rotate the camera, if the other telegraph pole doesn't come into view, then you've found your no parallax point. So it's a bit of a trial and error, but when you've done it with a prime, that point that you need to slide the camera back along that nodal rail doesn't change, and so you can basically commit that to memory or write it down, and that no parallax point will be that point on that prime lens forever and a day. Let's move forward. You probably understand that I have a love of primes rather than zooms, and I was really keen to make this video tutorial because often people do ask me which zoom they should buy, and I often say, well, there are good choices of zooms, but I personally nearly always choose a prime. This rule or preference often breaks down when I need to get a reach above and beyond that 135mm focal length. So yes, I have a 100-400 G master and I have the 200-600 G, but for a long time I've been wanting to acquire this 400mm f2.8 prime lens. Now, we were saving weight and often we were saving money by buying primes instead of zooms. That does not follow with this 400mm, and there's also a 600mm prime lens. They're heavier. This one's twice as heavy as the 100-400 f5.6, and it's very expensive. This is $12,000 US. And there's often a bit of a wait in order to acquire one of these lenses, where you can't just buy them off the shelf. Usually there's always a period of wait while you often get these, and that's simply because Sony can't keep up with the demand. This is almost a standard or essential lens for a professional sports photographer, is the 400mm f2.8. It does take a certain level of commitment to own one of these, both financially but also, as you can see from the inset image in that Pelican case which comes with when you buy the lens, is you've got to move this lens around and it doesn't fit in a messenger bag. So why would you own one of these lenses, these extraordinarily expensive and heavy prime lenses? It's all about the aperture. Two-stop advantage is what makes this lens twice as heavy and really expensive. It does have to collect an awful lot of light for that 2.8 aperture, and that front lens element is absolutely huge. Now, the reason it is so important, hopefully if you're viewing this on a large 4K monitor, you'll look at the detail in this image and go, wow, it is so sharp, and this person is moving at 200 kilometers an hour, 160 miles an hour, banked over in a corner, and I'm panning the image, and the lens, the tracking of the lens can keep up with the fastest of motorsports here. It becomes more important, that two-stop advantage, when we can see that the depth of field is really separating out the foreground characters looking to take a ball coming down from above, and that the crowd in the background is heavily defocused. If we're shooting this with the 200-600 with maximum aperture of 6.3, obviously the crowd is going to be, it's not going to be sharp, but it's going to start becoming much more obvious and therefore more distracting when we're looking at the characters or sports people in the foreground. So we look at that defocus ability to defocus the crowd in an arena. This is a great advantage, and in bad weather days we do have that two-stop advantage over ISO as well. We're going to be shooting at a quarter of the ISO, so forget the 3200 ISO, we're often shooting at 800 ISO when we're shooting sports, and that does allow us to crop aggressively and not have the noise become problematic, because when we're zooming in on the noise, if the noise simply isn't there at 800 ISO, we can still get away with heavily cropped images. Here I am shooting with the 400mm G Master in APS-C mode. the action has gone to the other end of the playing field. Now the 400G Master has a click ring on the lens, and you can assign a function to this click ring, and the function that I've assigned in this instance is to go from full frame to APS-C mode. So I don't need to come back to the camera body to press a custom key to go into APS-C mode. I can do that with while still holding the lens while the camera is still at my eye. And even now, though the lens is behaving like a 600mm f4 lens, the background is still heavily defocused, even though I'm a lot further away from the subjects. Now this one is not going to be for everyone. This subject that I'm about to cover, a lot of people will go, well, this is definitely not something that I would entertain, but I'm going to cover it anyway, because for some people carrying those really large heavy lenses around is something that they want to avoid, but they don't want to own APS-C cameras. So there is an opportunity for people using the high resolution cameras on the R cameras and the Alpha 1 to use APS-C lenses. Take a look at this slide where we've got an APS-C camera, the Alpha 6600, with the 70-350 lens, and that has an equivalent zoom range, a full frame equivalent of 105 to 525 millimeters. Look at the size of that in comparison to the 200-600, which is the nearest comparable lens in full frame. It's nearly 4 times heavier and twice as long, and so there is a huge advantage for an APS-C user to be using an APS-C camera with that zoom lens that has a lot of reach. So there is something to be said for shooting with an APS-C camera or in APS-C mode. There are going to be occasions where you just simply don't want to take that large, heavy, white telephoto zoom or telephoto prime out on location. So here I've got this image that I captured during the review process of the Alpha 1, where I'm using the 70-350 G. It is a premium piece of glass, and it does use a linear focus motor for speed of autofocus. Now on the Alpha 1, when I'm shooting in APS-C mode, I do actually get a reminder that I'm actually in APS-C mode. It's the only camera to date that does physically remind you in the viewfinder, the electronic viewfinder, that you are shooting in APS-C mode. Now there's going to be no doubt about that when I'm using an APS-C lens, because it's vastly smaller in size. But here we have a 21 megapixel image captured with that APS-C lens. And yes, you probably want to keep the ISO reasonably low. So this is a bright sunny day, so the noise isn't becoming problematic for me by cropping so heavily in on post-production. Here again on a sunny day, some people have told me online that the 70-350 is not a fast focusing lens. I'm having trouble computing that because I shot birds in flight, those kiteboarders, and also a MotoGP, and I've actually tested these lenses in those 3 situations, and I'm seeing that I'm getting sharp focus. So I don't see this as a slow focusing lens, but obviously some reviewers might beg to differ. This is the 70-350 shooting on the Alpha 6600. Now the ISO has climbed over 1600. It might be as high as 2500 ISO in this instance, and I've run a bit of noise reduction on the background just so the noise isn't too problematic, but I've not done any noise reduction on the bird itself. And you can see that noise is starting to become a little bit problematic with an f6.3 maximum aperture, where we're trying to use a fast shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second or faster. We can find the ISO climbing, and of course the APS-C cameras are not quite as good at high ISO as the full frame cameras. And so that would follow through if we start using the APS-C lens in APS-C mode on a full frame camera. Now this was captured on the Alpha 7R4. Now a lot of people do say that the high ISO performance of the Alpha 7R4 is not as good as the other full frame cameras. I think it's possibly one stop adrift or one stop behind. So if I'm shooting this at ISO 1000, it looks more like ISO 2000 on, say, the Alpha 7R3 or the Alpha 1 camera. So noise is starting to become a little bit problematic. Even at 1000 ISO in APS-C mode when we're shooting birds in flight, this is not something that I would recommend using the 70 to 350 with maximum aperture of f6.3. So you'd be much better off using the 100-400 G master with the maximum aperture of 5.6, or even choosing wider aperture primes such as the 2.8 400mm or the f4 600mm primes in order to keep the ISO low. Now I have run noise reduction on this, so you can get a better outcome if you are using an Alpha 7R4, but I don't think I would wholeheartedly recommend shooting in APS-C mode on the Alpha 7R4 at high ISO values. Now this is again with the 70 to 350 shooting at ISO 1600 without any noise reduction, and the noise in this Alpha 1 image is a lot finer, and so this is something that we can much more easily deal with in post-production by just doing lower levels of noise reduction in post-production. So this is an image that I captured with the 70 to 350 on the Alpha 1 at ISO 2500. Now things would be starting to get a little bit ugly on an Alpha 7R4, and on this Alpha 1 image you can see it's very much more in control. So the noise reduction on the background to make it silky smooth. If we look at the lower levels of noise reduction on the bird, we can see we've still got rich, fine textural detail of the plumage. So this is certainly something that could be considered, say, for an Alpha 1, especially if you're not looking for very, very fast shutter speeds. Here this is a portrait of a bird, so the shutter speed is at 1/250th of a second in order to keep the ISO as low as 2500 in this just past dawn shot here. So let's look at the APS-C mode of these cameras that I've been looking at. Again, 10 megapixels. It's a little bit tight, not something I'd recommend. On the 24 megapixel sensors you can just about get away with it if you only need just to straighten a slightly crooked image. It's something that you might consider. Much more opportunities with the Alpha 7R2, 7R3, Alpha 1 cameras to crop aggressively in post-production. I would put a limiter on people thinking of doing this on the Alpha 7R4. I think my upper comfort zone on the Alpha 7IV is around the 1250 rather than ISO 2500 that you saw me using earlier on the Alpha 1. If we look at that 2x crop, something that we'll be doing in post-production to get closer to our subject matter, we can't achieve a 2x crop on a 24 megapixel sensor because we'll go under the 4K size, and if a 4K image is important, then the software will have to interpolate that larger, and we will start losing a little bit of sharp focus in the process. We can just squeeze in that 2x crop on the 42 megapixel sensors on the Alpha 7R2, Alpha 7R3. We've got quite a lot of comfort on the Alpha 1. As you saw, I was pushing out the crop factor to 2.25 on there to get that extra reach. And on the Alpha 7R4, if we're cropping really aggressively on Alpha 7R4, I think I would have to limit the ISO to 800 to stay within my comfort zone. So you can see with the Alpha 7R4 I do have some reservations about shooting in APS-C mode or using those lenses with f5.6 or 6.3 apertures. Let's take a look at that 70 to 350, because one of the questions that came when I started talking about this lens on a full frame camera is why wouldn't you just choose the 70 to 300 G, the full frame lens that is roughly equivalent in reach to that crop sensor lens. Why would you even mention that when there's a full frame lens available? So let's take a look at a side-by-side comparison. First off, you're going to have to pay $500 more. Those are the B&H prices. Middle of 2021, you might find the full frame lens discounted more heavily, but when I created this video tutorial, it was 30% more expensive to go to the full frame, $500 more expensive. Now when we apply the crop factor to the 70-350, we end up with more reach. So we got a 105 to 525. Yes, you could shoot in APS-C mode using the 70-300, but we'd only we wouldn't get that much more reach. We'd get the 450 millimeter reach. So yes, we've got more reach using the APS-C camera. Now the aperture is similar on both lenses. It's actually the same on both lenses, f4.5 to 6.3. But remember, if we're shooting in APS-C mode, we're magnifying the noise, so it's not a completely level playing field. So the advantage does go to the full frame 70-300, especially for the Alpha 7R4 owners. The AF speed of the crop sensor lens, the 70-350, is actually faster than the full frame lens. It's a newer release lens using the newer linear focus motors, and so I have to give the advantage in AF performance to the APS-C lens. Now the lenses look equivalent in height when they're side by side, but the 70-350 full frame is fatter and heavier. Now it might on paper look just a little bit fatter and a little bit heavier, but it actually feels quite a lot heavier because that weight is extending out the front of the camera. So for me, it just feels a chunky lens on the full frame cameras. So again, we've got 35% heavier on that full frame lens. Now the full frame alternatives, I've had to list this for the Alpha 7R4 users. Would I choose the 70-300 if I was a full frame user? No, I wouldn't, because I'm still looking at that f6.3 aperture. So I'd be looking at possibly the 70-200 for F4 G. If you to get that wider aperture, you're going to more than halve your ISO by going for that F4 zoom, and you're getting the weight saving compared to the G Master. You could also look at that Tamron 70-180, because that does have the 2.8 aperture, so you're going to halve the ISO again. So anybody who's having issues with noise on the Alpha 7 IV, half and then half again. You're certainly starting to make things a lot more comfortable now. But you know, my personal preference, because of the croppability of the Alpha 7R4 files, I would just avoid the zooms altogether and go for the 135, 1.8, and then crop in post. And then you can really keep your ISO low. And that is a good companion for the Alpha 7R4, in my opinion, that can give you up to 300mm f4 equivalent reach, and you're using that f1 point aperture to keep your ISO really low. Now if you're thinking that the 70-350 APS-C lens is something that you could possibly consider, then you could also consider a walkabout lens such as the crop sensor 1655 f2.8 G. These two G zoom lenses that were designed for the APS-C cameras were their finest zoom lenses for APS-C. They are very sharp lenses, so we're not giving anything away in sharpness just because we're coming down to APS-C lenses. We're just losing megapixels. So compare that to the 2.8 G Master, you've got a $700 saving in cost. Constant aperture, 2.8 on both. You can see it's a much smaller lens, and one of the advantages of the crop sensor lens, the APS-C lens, is it's using the XD linear focus motors, and we have an older direct drive SSM motor on the 2470 G Master, so it's not the fastest focusing lens in Sony stable. It is a sort of an early G Master lens, lens for the mirrorless cameras, and so it doesn't have the latest focus motors in there. And we're looking at a lens that's almost half the weight, and when we put that on the bodies side by side, this is the camerasize.com. I'm comparing these, and you can see that's a lot more manageable. So for somebody who does value high resolution for their exhibition prints or croppability when doing their professional work, but if they're just going out on maybe taking some family snaps and they don't want to be changing lenses but they want the flexibility of a zoom, this APS-C is certainly something that might meet some photographers' needs, not all. If you ask me my personal preference, would I do that? I do own the lens, but again, I would come full circle and come back to, but I would just use the 35 and 85 as I've outlined before. And if I'm not wanting to change lenses that day, just switch the bodies. So there's one more zoom that is worth mentioning from the APS-C lineup, and that is the 1018 F4. If we're looking at an F4 equivalent in the full frame, it would be the 1635. Again, you're looking at a lens that is half the weight, much smaller as well. If you ask me what I would choose, and again it would be the option on the right, it would be the 20mm F1.8 Prime, and I would take my nodal rail for such times that I want to create that wider angle of view. Here is that F4 1018. It's got the equivalent zoom range, full frame equivalent zoom range of 15 millimeters to 28 millimeters equivalent angle of view. So we're even slightly wider than the 1635 there. Travel lenses is another popular question for me. People looking at the 24-240, the 10 times zoom, asking me what I think of it. Well, it's a 10 times zoom. In any lens that has maybe a 3 or 4 times zoom, once you get beyond that, there are compromises to be made. You might be compromising corner performance at the wider apertures, so there is a little bit of compromise. Now the 24-240 is also quite a heavy lens. It's a bit of a brick, and so yes, you don't have to change lens. Yes, you've got all of the focal lengths in one lens, but it is a heavy bit of kit when you combine that with a full frame camera. So the equivalent APS-C lens is an 18-135. It's not quite a 10 times zoom. I think it's a 7.5 times zoom. It is a sharp lens. It is again one of Sony's later zoom lenses, and yes, it does have one of those linear focus motors as well. It is possibly what I would choose if I had to go for a zoom lens, because I really did want to avoid all primes. I own that lens, and yes, it does have some compromises, wider focal lengths in the corners at wider apertures. It's not going to perform, say, like the 1655 APS-C lens, or even like my 20mm f1.8 Prime. So there are compromises when choosing travel lenses. Here's an example how much of a compromise. You can see I have an album on my Flickr Pro account just with images captured with this 18-135, and some people saying that there's compromise in this lens will wonder, well, I can't actually see the compromise because the images look great. And yes, they possibly do. We're just comparing it with G Master Glass, and it's not as great as G Master Glass. So if you're looking at this head and shoulders portrait of this, I think it's a falcon, you're going to be going, wow, that's really sharp. Yes, it does have really good central sharpness on this, and it really performs really well at the longer focal lengths. So yes, there's something to consider. Now, one of the things you may take away from this conversation about lenses is also about resolution of sensors. The higher resolution sensors, with their ability to crop more in post, do give people who lean more towards primes more opportunities to zoom in post-production, as well as zooming with their feet. And so I own the Alpha 7C as my second body, which I will often take out with a prime attached. But I think the perfect Alpha 7C camera for me would be an Alpha 7CR. Now I have no idea if Sony is going to go down this path, but certainly higher resolution that would allow me to get a 2x crop as well as a 1.5 crop will give me more flexibility in post-production. And of course, one of the things that everybody is waiting for is the Alpha 7 IV. Now, will Sony stay with the 24 megapixel sensor, or will they up the resolution? And for me, the increased resolution won't be better because it produces sharper images uncropped. It's better because you can produce bigger prints or crop more in post-production. So that will be the advantage of Sony using a higher resolution on the yet to be announced Alpha 7 IV camera. So if they go to 36 megapixels, yes, you'll get your 2x crop in post-production, and of course you'll get all of the autofocus AF tracking improvements that we've seen on the Alpha 7C. So those will be the two major things I'll be looking for, is more resolution and the newer AF tracking. The AF tracking will be a certainty, of course. It's just what Sony decide on the resolution front there. So hopefully you found something to make you think in that movie. Now, I've not covered all lenses, obviously there's just way too many to cover, but it's more about the type of lens that you're willing to invest in. Do you go for the 2.8 zooms, Sony? Do you go to the f4 zooms? Do you go to the 2.8 Tamrons? Or do you go for primes, and which primes, and how much inconvenience do you get by going for primes? And hopefully I've addressed all of those. And even for APS-C users who are thinking maybe going full frame, I've outlined some of the APS zooms that I think are definitely worth hanging on to. Now, there are not very many APS-C Sony primes that I really value. The 50mm 1.8 is okay, and there is a very expensive 24mm Zeiss designed APS-C lens, which is more expensive than my 20mm full frame, so I don't really recommend that one either. So it's really about those three APS-C zooms. Hopefully you found this useful. Obviously I'm wanting to continue the conversation, so just put your comments down in the comments fields below. So I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Imaging Ambassador, and I'll catch you online next time.